Hey, so I need to tell you about something that completely flipped my world. Growing up, my family had a pretty obvious favorite, my sister Poppy, and for years I just went along with it. But eventually, I realized I wasn't going to be pushed aside anymore. What happened next? Let's just say I used their own rules against them in a way they never saw coming. Before we dive in, I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? It's crazy how far stories like this can travel. Growing up, our family had a hierarchy that was impossible to ignore. Poppy, my older sister by 2 years, was always at the center of everything effervescent, magnetic, the kind of person who could walk into a room and instantly become its focus. She thrived on attention and knew exactly how to play the perfect daughter. Our parents, Samantha and Charles, not only noticed it, they nurtured it. They encouraged her dramatic flair, rewarded her charm, and seemed to celebrate her very existence. And me, well, I was the quiet, practical one, logical, self-sufficient, reliable. I did what needed to be done, solved problems behind the scenes, made sure everything ran smoothly. I was the foundation of the house, steady, unnoticed, essential, but invisible until something went wrong. Poppy was the chandelier, dazzling, impossible to ignore. Everyone notices the chandelier. No one notices the foundation unless it cracks. And, well, I was that foundation, solid, dependable, but rarely praised. It wasn't that I didn't love my sister, I did. I admired her charisma, her ability to charm, the way she made people laugh, the way she turned ordinary moments into events. But at the same time, it was impossible not to feel overshadowed. My accomplishments were quiet, practical, expected. I got good grades, followed the rules, helped out without complaint. And yet, the applause, the excitement, the proud smiles, it always seemed reserved for Poppy when she excelled. Our parents made sure everyone noticed. When I did, it was more like a nod, a quiet acknowledgement that I was doing what was expected. I was appreciated, but never celebrated. My father, Charles, was meticulous and precise, a financial advisor who valued order and control. Yet he was utterly charmed by Poppy's ability to turn the mundane into spectacular. He would hang on her every word, laugh at her jokes, treat her whims as brilliant ideas. My mother, Samantha, a retired teacher with a soft spot for drama and sentimentality, played along perfectly. Poppy knew exactly how to navigate this dynamic, which made her not only adored, but practically untouchable. She learned early on how to maximize her influence without effort. Me, I just kept things steady, managed the practical side of life, and silently endured the imbalance. Even at home, the contrast was clear. Poppy's room was vibrant, full of life and constantly evolving, an outward reflection of her personality and energy. Mine was orderly, functional, and predictable, reflecting my inner self. People gravitated toward Poppy's world. They hardly ever noticed mine. And that, over time, it sticks with you. It's not outright cruelty, it's just being invisible, being expected to handle things quietly while others receive the spotlight. You grow up internalizing this, thinking your contributions are less significant simply because they aren't flashy. School reflected this dynamic too. I did well academically, but it was practical success, good grades, responsible behavior, teacher approvals. Poppy excelled socially and theatrically. She could charm, entertain, and draw attention effortlessly. Her achievements were displayed, celebrated, Mine solid, reliable, quietly supporting the structure of our family, but barely acknowledged. Even our parents' subtle language reinforced this. Words like practical or responsible were meant to sound like praise, but were really coded messages: safe, expected, unremarkable. Family events were like live theater for this dynamic. Poppy's birthdays were extravagant. Decorations, carefully planned surprises, everything designed to dazzle. I handled logistics, made sure the events ran smoothly, fixed problems no one else noticed. And again, invisible work. People didn't clap for the foundation, they clapped for the chandelier. It wasn't resentment, exactly, at least not in the beginning. It was more a quiet understanding that my role was to support the show, not star in it. And sometimes that understanding ached, because being reliable and responsible was never enough to break through the glamour, never enough to shift the attention. I learned early that my value in the family was measured differently. Poppy's worth was her visibility, her charm, her ability to captivate. Mine was measured in function, in problem solving, in reliability. And slowly, you start noticing patterns: birthday gifts skewed, vacations centered around her desires, family conversations that highlighted her achievements while quietly omitting mine. I realized I was living in a household where recognition was rationed, and the ration was never meant for me. It wasn't just about money or events, it was about visibility, significance, and emotional investment. Poppy had it in abundance. I had it in subtle, quiet forms, often unnoticed. Over time, this pattern shaped me. I became acutely aware of fairness or the lack thereof. I learned to navigate the invisible currents, to anticipate needs, to avoid conflict, to maintain the balance of the house. I learned patience, strategic observation, and quiet resilience. But underneath it all, there was this simmering awareness that one day the imbalance would need to be addressed. That one day the scales that had been tipped in favor of the chandelier would need correction. And that foundation I had built quietly, patiently, unseen, it would be the base from which I could finally take action. By the time Poppy's wedding planning began, the hierarchy and imbalance had been ingrained in me for years. I'd learned to smile, to nod, to play my part. But I was also quietly aware that I had been overlooked for decades. I had witnessed, again and again, how my practical contributions were invisible while Poppy's dazzling presence was celebrated. That awareness, the simmering, quiet realization of inequity, was the lens through which I would view the events to come. It wasn't about jealousy, it was about principle, about being seen, acknowledged, and treated with the same care, attention, and fairness that had been lavished on Poppy, and that, ultimately, set the stage for everything that followed. When Poppy got engaged, it was like a switch flipped in our household. I was genuinely happy for her. I really was. She had found a nice guy, someone kind, steady, and sweet, but the moment the ring was on her finger, my parents went into overdrive. It was as if they had been waiting for this exact moment their whole lives. Charles, my father, usually meticulous and cautious with money, suddenly acted like no expense was too great. Mom, Samantha, my usually calm and measured mother, threw herself completely into bringing Poppy's vision to life. Their excitement was palpable, and I tried to match it, at least outwardly. Poppy had a vision that went way beyond a simple wedding. She wanted something almost regal, a historic estate for the ceremony, a custom couture gown that seemed more like a fashion show than a dress, a 10-piece band, and a 5-course meal designed by a celebrity chef. It was, honestly, staggering. I remember sitting at the dining room table one evening during a planning meeting, looking at the spreadsheets, flowers that cost more than my first car, tables that rivaled the finest restaurants in the city. I couldn't help but gently ask Dad, "Are you sure about this?" He just smiled, adjusting his glasses, as if I had asked a trivial question. "It's Poppy's special day. Thea, you only get one of those. We want to give her the best." And that was that. The numbers didn't stop climbing. They cashed out investments, dipped into savings, and when they talked about it, they seemed genuinely thrilled. The bill came to just over $75,000, every single cent covered by my parents. And the wedding itself, well, it was a spectacle. Poppy glided down the aisle in a dress with a train so long it required 2 of her bridesmaids to manage it. Her shoes were practically miniature works of art. The reception had ice sculptures, a champagne tower, and every detail felt curated to perfection. My parents were beaming, proud almost to the point of being blinding. It was easy to see how delighted they were, how much they wanted to make her feel like the center of the universe. And me, I was maid of honor, which meant my role was equal parts functional and performative. I fixed Poppy's train, held her bouquet, gave a speech about sisterhood that I forced into something heartfelt, but felt more like fiction, and smiled endlessly for the cameras. In my mind, I wanted to be happy for her, truly. And in public, I was. But there was this quiet, nagging sensation I couldn't shake. It wasn't jealousy of the wedding itself. I've never been the type to crave extravagance. No. It was about principle, about the glaring favoritism. The way every extravagant detail reinforced a hierarchy that had been present my whole life. A neon sign that said, "Poppy comes first. Thea, you follow quietly." At the time, I told myself to focus on the joy, to let my sister have her moment. I laughed when she laughed, toasted her happiness, even clapped a little too hard when they unveiled the cake. But inwardly, I noticed every little reinforcement of this imbalance. My parents' eyes would shine in admiration at her dress, her smile, the carefully staged moments. And when I spoke, suggested, or even corrected minor details, it was met with polite nods, a quiet, fleeting acknowledgement before the attention returned to Poppy. The contrast was almost comical if it weren't so emotionally sharp. It was like watching a live demonstration of favoritism, one that I was both part of and entirely outside of. There was this one meeting that's burned into my memory. I sat across from Dad, looking at the spreadsheet, trying to make sense of the budget. The numbers were astronomical. I remember saying softly, "This is a lot, isn't it?" And he just chuckled, adjusting his tie. "It's Poppy's special day. You only get one of those. We want to give her the best." That line, casual as it seemed, echoed in my head like a drumbeat of unfairness. Every extravagant choice, every lavish expense, confirmed the dynamic I had lived with for years. Poppy's happiness was priceless. Mine, by comparison, was always quietly managed, always scaled down, always practical. As the wedding day approached, the scale of everything became almost surreal. Invitations printed on thick, embossed paper, Flowers flown in from exotic locations, a band rehearsing for weeks, the catering tasting sessions that could easily have been a week-long vacation. And I was there, participating fully, helping make it happen, while simultaneously feeling a kind of disorientation. This was a wedding, yes, but it was also a showcase of the family hierarchy, a reminder that one daughter could command not just attention, but resources beyond imagination, while the other quietly supported in the shadows. The reception itself was like stepping into a dream, or maybe a movie. Poppy floated from guest to guest, radiating charm, her every movement celebrated. The ice sculptures glimmered, the champagne flowed, and every eye seemed to focus on her. My parents' faces were a mix of pride and awe, completely absorbed in this tableau. And me, well, I was still holding the practical side together. I smiled. I clinked glasses. I delivered my speech with the right amount of warmth. And yet, underneath, there was this persistent tug in my chest. The applause, the admiration, the excitement. It wasn't for me. It was for the chandelier, not the foundation. I remember thinking during this speech, holding back the trembling in my hands, that this was life distilled into a moment. The dynamics, the favoritism, the invisible balance, all of it laid bare. Poppy got the grandeur, the celebration, the spectacle. I got the role of caretaker, supporter, background facilitator. It was subtle, often brushed off with the words, "You're practical, Thea." Practical, a kind word, or so it seemed. But in our language, in our family's coded vocabulary, practical was polite for ordinary, expected, secondary. It was the label for the quiet daughter who did everything right, but never truly shined. And at that moment, in the midst of champagne towers and applause, I felt the weight of that label more than ever. It's hard to describe the mix of emotions. I wanted to be happy, to celebrate my sister, to feel proud of our family. And I did, in flashes, truly. But there was also a quiet ache, a recognition of the imbalance that had been present for decades. Every extravagant choice, every lavish expense, every gleaming smile directed at Poppy, it was a vivid reminder that, for my parents, their investment in happiness was unequal. And while I carried out my duties with grace, the discomfort simmered quietly beneath the surface. I wasn't just the maid of honor. I was a witness to the long-running pattern of favoritism that had defined my entire life. A year after Poppy's over-the-top wedding, my own engagement with Kyle was a completely different story. Kyle's a civil engineer, steady, reliable, the kind of person who quietly solves problems without fanfare. Our relationship was the same, calm, comfortable, built on mutual respect, shared goals, and a love that didn't need to be flashy. When he proposed, I was over the moon, and for the first few moments, I thought maybe my parents would show a little of the same excitement they had for Poppy. But, well, that wasn't exactly what happened. When we told them, their response was polite. Mom hugged us, said congratulations, and then almost immediately asked, "So, have you set a date?" There wasn't the frantic, bubbly energy that had accompanied Poppy's engagement. No offers to start a planning binder, no calls to book venues before we even finished our sentence. It was pleasant. The kind of mild interest you'd show to a neighbor's kid who graduated. I had held on to a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd offer to chip in, even a little, given the precedent set by Poppy's wedding. But there it was, Clear as day, the enthusiasm was lukewarm, measured, and completely proportional to the scale of our plans, which, in our eyes, were perfect for us. Kyle and I had already talked it out. We wanted a simple, intimate ceremony at a local botanical garden and a small reception at our favorite restaurant with a beautiful private room. The budget was modest, around $15,000, money we'd saved up and were ready to spend ourselves. And we weren't expecting a handout. But the stark contrast between how our parents threw themselves into Poppy's dreams and how casually they approached ours, it was kind of staggering. I couldn't help the tiny sting in my chest as I imagined Poppy's wedding. Every detail lavishly funded and praised, versus our understated plans being met with polite nods. We invited my parents and Poppy over for dinner to share our vision. I explained everything: the gardens, the cozy restaurant, focusing on good food, good company, and a meaningful day rather than extravagance. Mom sipped her wine and said, "That sounds lovely, dear, very practical, just like you." And there it was again. Practical, not a compliment in our family. Practical meant predictable, dull, less than Poppy was dazzling, creative, visionary. I was practical, responsible, quiet. Kyle added reassuringly, "We're excited to host a day that feels like us without starting our marriage in debt." My dad nodded, a thoughtful look crossing his face, and said, "Very responsible, the twin sister of practical, the gentle, subtle way my parents reduced my achievements to labels that were safe, but ultimately diminished." My heart sank a little. The silence lingered, stretching across the table like a thin, tense curtain. I held my breath, waiting for some acknowledgement, a small gesture of support, some sign that maybe my happiness mattered as much as Poppy's had. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "Well, speaking of the wedding," he began, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. "Your mother and I were talking, and we have a wonderful idea that will help you save a significant amount of money." I leaned forward, heart fluttering. Could they actually be offering some financial help for the venue or catering? But then Mom's eyes twinkled and she said, "It's about your dress. We have the perfect solution." She repeated it, almost theatrically. "We have the perfect solution." My stomach dropped, my curiosity mixed with that nagging sense of unease. Kyle gave my hand a supportive squeeze. I braced myself. Dad, adopting the precise financial advisor tone he used for client meetings, laid it out. A wedding dress is a huge expense. Thea, an emotional purchase that gets worn once and then sits in a box for 50 years. It's not a sound investment. I blinked. Wait, what? Then Mom chimed in, reverent and almost proud. Poppy's dress. It's exquisite, professionally clean, preserved. It's just sitting in the attic. The words sank in slowly, and then, like a punch to the gut, it hit me. They were suggesting I wear Poppy's $10,000 wedding dress, a hand-me-down, a symbolic reinforcement of my secondary status. My parents, who had spent tens of thousands to make Poppy feel like a princess, were offering me the leftovers. I stared at them, stunned. Kyle stiffened beside me, sensing the tension. Dad continued, with that confident smile that always meant he thought he'd solved a problem. Brilliantly. "It's already paid for. It will save you thousands, and it's practical." My mother nodded eagerly. Pleased with their solution, they expected gratitude, maybe even tears. What they got was stunned silence. I couldn't even form words at first. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't about being practical. It was about principle, fairness, respect, and the blatant absence of it. Then, Poppy, who had been unusually quiet, spoke. It's a brilliant idea, isn't it? You'd look beautiful in it. Thea, might need a few alterations. Of course you're a bit straighter than I am. A subtle dig at my body, the final straw. That cold weight in my stomach turned into a hot, rising anger. Their smug, proud faces were still expecting gratitude. I realized they truly didn't understand the audacity of the suggestion. It wasn't a gift. It was a reminder of my place. They wanted me to erase my identity, walk down the aisle in my sister's shadow. I couldn't. I spoke up. My voice quiet but firm. No. Their smiles faltered. No, Mom repeated, confused. I took a breath. No. I will not be wearing Poppy's wedding dress. I appreciate the thought, but I want to choose my own dress. The experience is important to me. The lie of appreciation tasted like acid in my mouth. Dad frowned, incredulous. Don't be emotional about this. Thea, think of the savings. That money could go towards a down payment on a house. Hypocrisy hit me like a tidal wave. The man lectured me about practicality while having just bankrolled a $75,000 wedding for Poppy. I pressed sharper than I intended. Did you tell Poppy to be practical when she wanted a $10,000 dress? Did you tell her the money could go towards a house? The room shifted. Dad's face hardened. Mom's eyes welled with tears. We just thought it would be nice to pass something down, she said defensively. I shot back. It's not an heirloom. It's a 2-year-old dress you bought for my sister. An heirloom is my grandmother's locket, which you also gave to Poppy. Even the locket had been used as a token for her. Not me. Kyle, calm as ever, finally stepped in. With all due respect, Charles, Samantha, this is our wedding. Thea deserves to choose her own dress. We're not asking for financial help. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just a dress. It was a pattern, a lifetime of being minimized, of achievements met with polite nods while Poppies were celebrated with parades. The dinner ended with tears, frustration, and Kyle's steady hand reminding me I wasn't imagining this inequity. That night, as I lay in bed replaying every word, I felt clarity start to cut through the anger. My parents had shown me my value in their eyes, and it wasn't high. They'd handed me the leftovers of their investment in Poppy, and now I had to decide how to respond. It wasn't about jealousy anymore. It was about fairness, respect, and reclaiming my right to be seen. The night after dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The dress, the subtle digs, the casual dismissal of my feelings, it all replayed over and over in my head. I kept asking myself, how could they see this as practical, as responsible, as fair? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about a dress. It was about a pattern, a calculated favoritism that had been going on for decades. And if there was a way to challenge that pattern, I had to find it. Kyle noticed my quiet tension and came over, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. Still thinking about it, he asked gently. I nodded, leaning back against him, my mind racing. It's not just the dress, I said. It's the $75,000. It's the fact that they did all this for Poppy and offered me her leftovers, pretending it's practical. Kyle stayed quiet for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. Then he said something that lit a spark in my mind. You know your dad, right? He keeps records of everything, every dollar, every gift, and every expense. He's meticulous about it. Maybe there's a record of what he spent on Poppy's wedding. A light bulb went off. Of course. My father was obsessed with records. Spreadsheets, binders, receipts, you name it. If there was a way to prove that Poppy's wedding expenses were handled differently, it would be in his files. I felt a thrill mixed with fear. This could be the evidence I needed, but it also meant stepping into territory I'd never explored before. It meant sneaking into his domain and facing the truth head-on. A few days later, under the pretense of wanting to look through old photo albums for our wedding slideshow, I went to my parents' house. Mom was in the kitchen, eager to show me some new tea she'd bought, completely distracted. I nodded along, smiled, even laughed at a story she was telling. But my focus was elsewhere. I had one destination in mind, Dad's home office. The office was exactly as I remembered it from childhood. A sanctuary of oak furniture, leather-bound books, and filing cabinets lined up like soldiers. My hands trembled slightly as I approached the drawers labeled with taxes, insurance, household expenses. And then, like a siren in my mind, I sought family finances. My stomach flipped. This felt like a betrayal, a breach of trust. But the injustice I'd felt my whole life outweighed that fear. I opened the drawer slowly, almost reverently. Inside were binders, each meticulously labeled, organized like an archive of our family's history. I flipped through the labels: Thea education, Poppy education, Poppy car loan. My heart started to pound. There it was, the main ledger, thick, brimming with spreadsheets detailing major family expenses over the last 15 years. I hesitated, then pulled it out and carefully set it on the desk. My eyes scanned the entries. There were sections for Poppy the car down payment logged, a small loan for her event planning business, forgiven on her 30th birthday, and various smaller amounts. Each line confirmed a pattern of support, small but deliberate. Then I turned to the period covering Poppy's wedding. My finger traced the line's payments for the home, property taxes, a vacation to Italy, but nothing. No caterer, no venue, no florist, not a single line item for the $10,000 couture gown. $75,000 vanished from the official record. My breath caught. I stared at the page, shock and disbelief washing over me. They had not recorded the wedding expenses. It hadn't been in advance. It hadn't been properly documented. It had been a gift, given outside the rules my father always preached. A manipulation disguised as practicality. A secret designed to maintain the illusion that both daughters were treated equally. I felt my fingers shake as I pulled out my phone. Carefully, I began photographing each page, every loan, every gift to Poppy, the conspicuous absence of her wedding costs. Click, click, click. I even photographed the first page of the binder, where Dad had written his family financial charter, a pompous document declaring that all substantial gifts to children would be recorded and treated as an advance on inheritance to ensure fairness. The irony was delicious, almost cinematic. Dad had written the rules, but hadn't followed them when it really counted. As I slipped the binder back into the filing cabinet, heart pounding, I felt an unexpected calm. The shock had been sharp, yes, but now it was tempered by clarity. I had the proof, The inequity I'd always felt wasn't in my imagination, it was documented, measurable, undeniable. The mix of shock and calm started to morph into empowerment. I had the leverage, I had the evidence, and suddenly, the pattern that had seemed so insurmountable for decades felt something I could confront, something I could finally challenge. Sitting back at the kitchen table with Mom, laughing over crooked bangs and Poppy's princess costumes, I felt a subtle shift inside me. I was no longer just the quiet, practical daughter who endured the favoritism silently. I was armed with facts, with proof. The seed of a plan began to take root in my mind. I didn't need to shout or confront yet. The evidence itself was powerful, a quiet, unstoppable force. And Kyle, ever my calm and steady partner, reminded me that this was a moment to strategize, not explode. He understood immediately. "This is huge," he said, his voice low, awestruck. They kept it off the record on purpose, didn't they? Exactly, I thought. My father, who had spent his life preaching fairness, had deliberately circumvented his own rules to favor Poppy. And now, unknowingly, he had given me a tool, a ledger, a charter, and photographic proof of their unequal treatment. I felt a mix of anger and exhilaration, the injustice of it all, the audacity of their expectation that I simply accept the leftovers of their favoritism, had fueled a quiet resolve. This wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about fairness, about acknowledging a long-standing inequality that had defined my entire life. And for the first time, I felt the scales tipping in my favor. That evening, back at our condo, I laid everything out on the living room floor for Kyle, the binder photos, the ledger entries, the family financial charter. They were all there, meticulously organized. Kyle studied them carefully, his analytical mind processing the layers of information. He shook his head in disbelief. He spent all that money, deliberately didn't record it, and then lectured you on being practical and responsible. That's insane. I nodded, a cold thrill running through me. Exactly, I said. He broke the rules to favor Poppy, and then had the nerve to expect me to accept leftovers. It was audacious, and it was the leverage I needed. The realization settled in the rules my father held. Sacred fairness, transparency, accounting for every gift had been applied selectively. And now, with the ledger in my hands, I could finally see the pattern, the method behind the favoritism. The shock had transformed into calm determination. I wasn't just Thea, the quiet daughter anymore. I was Thea, the observer, the designer, the one who could see the flaws in the structure and plan a careful, strategic response. I felt a rush of empowerment, a quiet, methodical energy that was almost intoxicating. The next steps, the plan, would be calculated, precise, and based on evidence that could not be ignored. The playing field had shifted, and for the first time, I had the tools to tilt it back. After confirming that Poppy's wedding expenses had been left off the record, I knew I couldn't stop there. I needed to see the bigger picture. It wasn't enough to just have the ledger. I had to understand the full scope of how my parents and Poppy handled money, and why the imbalance had persisted for so long. This wasn't about snooping, it was about figuring out the pattern, seeing how deliberate it all had been, and I had a plan for how to do it, methodically. First, I looked into my parents' finances. Dad always portrayed himself as careful, measured, and savvy with money. But I needed more than just impressions. I started with property records, publicly available information that gave me a sense of their assets. The house alone was worth a decent sum, and when I compared it to the expenditures I'd already seen on Poppy's wedding, it was clear that $75,000 was a significant chunk of their liquid funds. Not ruinous, but meaningful. That helped me contextualize the gift. They weren't rolling in money to the point where it didn't matter. They had chosen to spend extravagantly on Poppy, and that choice wasn't random. Next, I needed to understand Poppy's financial situation. She lived in an apartment that looked like it came straight out of a design magazine. She drove a newer car, went on frequent vacations, and her lifestyle seemed just slightly out of reach of what her freelance event planning work could sustain. I'd always suspected that my parents were subsidizing her life beyond the wedding, and the ledger confirmed part of that. But I needed more evidence, something concrete that showed a pattern over time. Social media became my window into her spending habits. I spent an evening scrolling through Instagram and Facebook, piecing together years of posts. It was tedious, almost obsessive, but every detail mattered. There were trips to Bali, Aspen, and long weekends in New York for Broadway shows. Every photo, every caption, every tag became a data point. I cross-referenced the dates with the ledger, looking for correlations. Some of the more expensive-looking trips coincided with periods when Mom had mentioned cash withdrawals vaguely, things that never seemed tied to home improvements or other plausible reasons. It wasn't absolute proof, but it painted a picture of a steady, off-the-book stream of support. A pattern was emerging, subtle but undeniable. Then there was my aunt, Mom's sister. She had always had a soft spot for me, and I knew she liked to talk. I called her under the pretense of asking for a family recipe, chatting casually about wedding planning and how stressful budgeting could be. And as I expected, she opened up in ways that were both revealing and confirming. "Oh, I know," she said, with a sigh. "Your mother was so stressed during Poppy's wedding planning. Charles was in a state for months. I faked surprise. Really, they seemed so happy about it," I said, trying to sound casual. "Oh, they were happy for Poppy," my aunt clarified. "But the money, that was a different story. Samantha had to sell a portion of Charles's stock portfolio he was saving for retirement. He wasn't happy about it, but Poppy had her heart set on that venue. It set their retirement plans back at least 5 years. Bingo. That was the confirmation I needed. The wedding hadn't just been a lavish gift, it had been a deliberate, financially impactful choice, made entirely to satisfy Poppy. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a long-term, calculated decision with real consequences. And what made it worse, in my eyes, was that when it came to me, the same consideration, the same investment, wasn't applied. My parents expected me to be grateful for the scraps, the hand-me-down dress, the label of practicality. It wasn't about generosity, it was about a hierarchy they had maintained for decades. The final piece of the puzzle was the dress itself. I needed to know exactly how much it had cost. Poppy had been vague, calling it couture, which, let's be honest, could mean a lot of things. I did a little online sleuthing using photos from her wedding to track down the designer. I sent an anonymous email to the bridal boutique, posing as a potential buyer with a reference photo. A reply came back quickly. The dress, with custom alterations, had cost just under $10,000. A staggering figure, And the fact that my parents expected me to wear it as a solution made the situation almost farcical if it weren't so infuriating. With every piece of information, I gathered the property records, the social media evidence, my aunt's confirmation, and the dress cost. The picture became clear. This wasn't a case of casual generosity or incidental inequality. It was a long-term, deliberate pattern of favoritism, carefully managed and hidden under a veneer of fairness. They had sacrificed their financial stability for Poppy's happiness, but could not, or would not, offer the same for me. Every layer of evidence built on the previous one, creating a mosaic of deliberate neglect and biased investment. It was almost elegant in its cruelty. I organized all of it into a neat, undeniable presentation. Ledger photos, a timeline of financial support, cross-referenced social media posts, aunt's testimony, and the dress invoice all lined up to form a compelling narrative. I felt like I was preparing a case, not for a courtroom, but for my family. And in a way, that was exactly what it was. The jury would be them, and the verdict would finally make them confront the consequences of their choices. What struck me most in this process was the emotional clarity it gave me. The initial sting of being treated as second best had transformed into a methodical resolve. The shock and disappointment I had felt at the dinner table had been replaced by focus and determination. The ledger and the evidence weren't just papers and screenshots. They were a tangible representation of what I had felt my whole life ignored, minimized, overlooked. While Poppy was celebrated and elevated at every turn, and now, for the first time, I had the tools to confront that imbalance. As I looked at the photos, the spreadsheets, and the documents on my laptop, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. There was still anger, yes, but it was focused, not chaotic. It was analytical, not reactive. This was about more than just a dress or a wedding. It was about fairness, respect, and recognition. And finally, armed with evidence, I felt that I could do something about it. The pattern was laid bare. The favoritism documented and the imbalance quantified. There was no denying it now. Kyle watched me as I explained everything, piece by piece. His quiet understanding was a comfort. So he broke his own rules, he said finally, after scanning the ledger photos to favor Poppy, and then lectured you about being practical. Wow, that's unreal. I nodded, feeling both vindicated and energized. Exactly. The rules had been written for fairness, but selectively applied. Now, with this evidence, I could force the rules to matter, to be enforced, and finally, to correct a long-standing imbalance. The shock had turned into calm clarity, and the clarity into strategy. It was a turning point. For the first time, I felt empowered rather than sidelined. The evidence didn't just prove favoritism, it provided the blueprint for holding them accountable, for asserting my worth, and for taking control of a narrative that had long been dictated by my parents' biases. And in that moment, I realized something profound. The past 30 years had been a rehearsal for this. All the subtle and quiet moments of being the practical, ignored daughter had trained me for this precise act of strategic, thoughtful empowerment. I wasn't just reacting. I was designing a solution. The system was flawed, but I had the tools to fix it, and finally, I understood how to do it. Once I had the full picture ledger photos, social media evidence, and my aunt's confirmations, I began thinking like I do at work. As an architectural designer, I looked at my family the way I would in a building with structural flaws. Every system had a load, and in our case, it was emotional and financial weight. For decades, my parents had piled it all onto one side, elevating Poppy, leaving me holding up the other side with no support. It was unstable, lopsided, and now I could see exactly where the weaknesses were. I started drafting a plan, quietly, deliberately, in my mind. Phase 1 was about establishing my independence and creating an unavoidable consequence for their behavior. I didn't want drama or shouting. That would be impulsive, reactive, and would let them claim victimhood. No, I wanted a controlled, strategic move that would make the inequity undeniable, without me having to raise my voice. Kyle was in the loop from the start. We sat at our kitchen table, the binder open between us, and I walked him through my reasoning. It's not about revenge, I told him. It's about boundaries. About ensuring our wedding is for the people who genuinely support us. If they want to continue playing favorites, then they need to experience the consequences. He nodded slowly, absorbing it. So, what's the first step, he asked, his voice calm, steady. I explained that I had made the calculations. The first phase would involve carefully removing my parents and Poppy from the wedding guest list. It had to be done quietly, without announcements or public drama, so that their reactions would be organic and revealing. This wasn't punishment for the sake of punishment. It was a design decision. The structure of our wedding, our experience, depended on who was actually invested in us as a couple and who was only performing for appearances. I envisioned it like drafting a blueprint. Each step had to be precise, each line deliberate. Sending them an invitation too early would have triggered frantic calls and potential manipulation. Waiting too long would seem careless or passive. The timing had to be calculated so that when they discovered they weren't invited, the impact would be undeniable, but not exaggerated. It needed to be a firm boundary, and for the first time, the decision rested fully with me. I made a list of people who would genuinely be there for us. My aunt, who had always supported me, my cousins, Kyle's family, friends who had witnessed our relationship and offered unconditional encouragement. Around 50 people, intimate, meaningful, fully aligned with the energy we wanted for our wedding. Then I listed the names we would remove: Samantha, Charles, Poppy, and her husband. 4 names that represented decades of neglect, favoritism, and emotional imbalance. Kyle studied the list carefully. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. Eyes serious. "This is permanent. There's no going back once they realize it." I took a deep breath. I was sure. They left me no choice. I said, "A wedding is a celebration of love and support. My parents and sister have shown that they do not support me in the ways that matter. Their presence would be a performance, not genuine. I don't want actors at our wedding. I want people who actually care about us. Them being there would be a lie, and I'm done with lies." We discussed logistics quietly, methodically. The invitations would be sent to the approved list. No explanation needed for the omission, no announcements, no hints. Just the reality that they were not invited. I imagined their reactions: confusion, disbelief, attempts to salvage appearances. That uncertainty, the suspense, was part of the structure of my plan. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about letting the consequences of their choices manifest naturally. As the days passed, I noticed a shift in myself. I wasn't anxious or reactive. I was focused, calm, even a little exhilarated. Each step in the planning felt like laying a beam, placing a support, ensuring the structure was sound. The emotional and financial imbalance had been glaring for years, and now, for the first time, I was intentionally balancing it. I also considered potential pushback. My parents could try to guilt me, argue, or manipulate. Poppy might attempt subtle digs, small but piercing. That was why I made sure all communication, if any, would be direct, clear, and controlled. I would not get pulled into arguments. I would not justify my decisions beyond the facts. My confidence grew as I realized that I had constructed a strategy where the structural integrity of our wedding day, the people, the energy, the emotional space was in my hands. This wasn't chaos. It was deliberate, a quiet demolition of old patterns and careful reconstruction of the environment we wanted to inhabit. Kyle remained my steady anchor. Every night we reviewed details. Every minor decision was made with intention. Seating, timing, vendor communications all aligned with the plan. The subtle thrill of this quiet empowerment was unlike anything I had felt before. I could feel the tension building beneath the surface of what was yet to come. This wasn't about shouting or drama. It was about calculated consequences and the anticipation that comes when people finally have to reckon with the results of their choices. I imagined Dad's meticulous mind running through possibilities, trying to anticipate my next move. That thought made me smile quietly. Every step had been designed to use his own principles, his obsession with structure and accountability against the imbalance he had cultivated. Poppy's sense of entitlement, Mom's performative concern, all of it would collide with the reality I had orchestrated. And Kyle, calm as ever, reminded me that the power in this approach wasn't cruelty, it was clarity and fairness. I wasn't overreacting. I was correcting an asymmetry that had been tolerated for decades. The final detail was ensuring that this phase of the plan would remain discreet until the right moment. Invitations were prepared, guest confirmations handled, vendors notified. No hints, no accidental slips, nothing to alert my family that the plan was already in motion. I wanted the moment of realization to be theirs alone, undiluted by explanations or justifications. The tension, the suspense, was part of the design. It would make the impact of their absence clear and undeniable, a direct reflection of the consequences of their prior actions. As the week progressed, I felt the mixture of anticipation and quiet satisfaction grow. Every structural decision I made, the layout of the wedding, the guest list, the controlled communication was like drafting an architectural blueprint for a day that would be ours. Fully controlled and supported by those who genuinely cared. And yet, under that control, there was a subtle tension, an energy that kept me on edge. This wasn't reckless. This was careful, deliberate. Every choice was informed by evidence, by years of observation, by understanding the imbalance and deliberately designing a response. In private, I allowed myself moments of reflection. I thought about how far I had come from the quiet, overlooked daughter in the shadow of a chandelier named Poppy. The anger I had felt had evolved into a calm, strategic mindset. I was no longer simply reacting. I was designing a structure that corrected the imbalance, a plan that would allow me to reclaim agency over my wedding and my own life. Kyle's steady presence reminded me that this wasn't just about the past. It was about creating a foundation for our future, one based on mutual respect, support, and love. Finally, the plan was ready. Invitations prepared, guests finalized, communications carefully controlled. The first phase of my strategy, the quiet, my deliberate act of disinviting my parents and sister, was set. I knew that once the invitations were sent, the consequences would unfold naturally. No confrontation, no dramatic announcement, just a carefully designed outcome that reflected the reality of years of favoritism and inequity. And for the first time, I felt completely in control of the narrative, the structure, and the space that Kyle and I were about to inhabit for our wedding day. The stage was set, the tension palpable, and I was ready to watch the carefully constructed dominoes begin to fall. With the first phase of our plan quietly in motion, it was time to move to phase 2, the financial reckoning. I knew I couldn't just storm in and start yelling. That would play right into their hands. Let them gaslight me or make me the villain. No. This had to be strategic, precise, like the architectural plans I spent my days drafting. I needed to confront my father armed with undeniable facts, leveraging his own rules against him. Kyle and I sat down, spreading out the ledger photos, the family financial charter, and every bit of evidence we'd collected. I walked him through it carefully. "Look at this," I said, pointing at the ledger photos. Every small gift, every loan that was properly documented for Poppy, but nothing from her wedding. $75,000 unaccounted for. Kyle leaned in, absorbing the magnitude of it, and the charter he asked. I nodded. The financial charter he wrote himself. It explicitly says all substantial gifts must be logged and treated as an advance on inheritance to ensure fairness. But for Poppy's wedding, nothing. Kyle's eyebrows shot up. Wow, that's really deliberate. I took a deep breath, feeling that mix of calm clarity and simmering frustration. Exactly. And that's why the next step is crucial. I'm going to confront him, and I'll present the evidence, not with anger, not with drama, but in a way that's completely indisputable. The ledger and charter aren't opinions, they're rules. And right now, those rules work in our favor. I called Dad the next evening. His voice answered, calm but with that underlying authority I'd grown up fearing. "Thea, what's this about?" I began quietly, deliberately, keeping my tone measured. "Dad, I've reviewed the family ledger and your financial charter. I found something concerning. The $75,000 spent on Poppy's wedding was never recorded as an advance on her inheritance. As your own rules require, all other significant gifts were documented. This one wasn't." There was a pause. I could almost hear him processing. "Are you implying I acted unfairly?" he asked, the edge of defensiveness creeping in. "I'm not implying anything," I said, firm but calm. "I'm stating a fact. The ledger and the charter are clear. This expenditure should have been logged, reconciled, and treated the same as any other substantial gift. It wasn't. The numbers don't lie." "Dad," a long silence followed. I could feel the subtle shift in power. For decades, he had been in control, dictating the rules and their selective enforcement. Now, those same rules were being wielded against him, and he could do nothing but listen. I pressed on, laying out the options strategically. "You have 2 choices," I said, keeping my voice steady, almost clinical. "Choice A, you accept that we will proceed with the wedding without your attendance, and we discuss our future relationship afterward. Choice B. You ensure Poppy signs a formal loan agreement acknowledging the $75,000 as an advance on her inheritance, drafted by a lawyer, legally binding, and fully compliant with your financial charter. I paused, letting it settle. The silence on the line was almost tangible, or, I added, my tone unwavering. You could risk me sharing this information, the ledger, the charter, the details about your retirement funds with Aunt Sarah, cousins, and extended family. Let them decide what's fair. His voice tightened. You wouldn't. Try me, I said quietly. There was no malice in my tone, just clarity and resolve. I'm not threatening. I'm presenting facts. The rules exist. You applied them selectively. Now, it's time to follow them or face the consequences. I could almost hear him recalculating, imagining the arguments, the negotiations that would follow, the leverage he thought he had over me, slowly slipping. My words were calm, measured, but each one carried weight. I wasn't just the quiet and a practical daughter anymore. I was a designer solving a problem, restructuring an uneven system, and exposing its flaws with precision. A few tense days later, an email arrived. Subject line: Family Matter. My heart raced as I opened it. Attached was a single PDF, a formal loan agreement drafted by a lawyer, Poppy, my parents, Charles and Samantha, all signatures included. The agreement acknowledged the $75,000 as a loan to be considered an advance on Poppy's inheritance. Repayment terms were low interest, with deductions to her share upon inheritance, if unpaid. Everything was exactly as I had envisioned. I showed Kyle the email. He read it, stunned. She actually signed it, he murmured, shaking his head. I nodded, a strange wave of satisfaction and relief washing over me. They had complied, forced to follow the rules they preached. But the victory was tempered. I knew it wasn't about conscience or fairness. It was about appearances and avoiding embarrassment. Still, it was mine. The power had shifted. The email from Dad was concise, cold. The documentation you requested is attached. Please confirm receipt. We expect to receive our invitations for your wedding by courier tomorrow. I paused before replying. I wanted my response to be calm, precise, and final. I acknowledged receipt, thanked them for correcting the ledger, and clarified that while the legal and financial matter was resolved, it did not erase decades of favoritism or the emotional damage they had inflicted. My decision to disinvite them from the wedding remained, and I would not debate it further. Once sent, I blocked their numbers, not out of spite, but to protect the boundary I had established. The days leading up to the wedding were unnervingly quiet. There were no angry calls, no manipulative texts, no thinly veiled comments from Poppy. The tension hung like a still, controlled energy, a quiet validation that my strategy had succeeded. Kyle and I focused on the final wedding preparations, our attention on the people and elements that mattered, our intimate guest list. The flowers, the food, the music. Every detail reinforced the structure I had built a wedding, reflecting genuine love and support rather than familial expectation or performance. Looking back, I realized how significant the shift had been. For the first time, I held the power in my own hands, enforcing fairness in a system that had long ignored it. The ledger, the charter, the signed loan agreement, they weren't just documents. They were a tangible representation of decades of inequity, finally acknowledged. and I had ensured that accountability would be applied. I felt a sense of liberation unlike anything I had experienced. The confrontation had been deliberate, strategic, and calm, and yet its impact reverberated across our family dynamic. I was no longer simply the overlooked daughter. I was a designer of outcomes, a strategist, and finally, the executor of a long overdue correction. The power had shifted, the rules enforced, and I had reclaimed control of my story, and in that quiet and deliberate way. I understood for the first time that the imbalance had not just been exposed, it had been corrected, at least on paper, and that made all the difference for the future I was building with Kyle. Our wedding day arrived, and it was everything Kyle and I had hoped for, but in a way that was completely different from Poppy's extravaganza. The sun was bright, the garden smelled of fresh blooms, and there was this feeling of calm and ease that I hadn't realized I'd been craving. Only about 50 people were there, but each one mattered. They were the ones who had actually supported us, cheered for us, loved us without expectation or performance. My aunt stood beside me, eyes glistening, and Kyle's best friend, who'd known him since kindergarten, was his groomsman. No one was there to play a part. They were there because they wanted to be. And it made the day feel authentic in a way I couldn't have imagined. As I walked down the aisle, I felt a weight lift. I was wearing the dress I had chosen, the one that made me feel like myself, strong, confident, elegant, and completely at ease. It was nothing like Poppy's $1,000 couture gown or the elaborate train that required multiple bridesmaids to manage, but that simplicity was perfect. Every step, every smile from a genuine friend, every soft look from Kyle reinforced the fact that this day was ours, built on care, thought, and love, not on anyone else's expectations. I could feel freedom coursing through me, a freedom I had never known in a family dynamic that had always placed me second. The ceremony itself was intimate, full of laughter, a few tears, but most of all, honesty. Our vows were personal, spontaneous, and heartfelt, reflecting the partnership and equality that defined our relationship. There were no scripted performances, no pressure to impress anyone, no spotlight on anyone but us. And I realized how profoundly different this was from Poppy's wedding. Lavish, opulent, a display designed to impress and reinforce her position as the favorite. Our day was grounded, real, and for the first time, I truly felt like the center of a space built for me, not overshadowed by someone else's spotlight. At the reception, in our cozy private room at the restaurant, the energy was warm and supportive. Conversations flowed, laughter echoed, and there was a sense of genuine connection. My aunt pulled me aside at one point, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. "I'm so proud of you, Thea," she whispered. "I know that was the hardest thing you've ever had to do, but you did it. You stood up for yourself." Her words hit me deeply. It wasn't just about the wedding day, it was about the years of standing quietly, often overlooked, and finally asserting my right to be seen and respected. Throughout the day, I reflected on the decisions that led us here, blocking my parents' numbers, disinviting them, and using the financial ledger as leverage. It all felt like a necessary reclamation of power. The signed loan agreement and the enforcement of the family charter were tangible proof that fairness could be applied, even in a family that had long ignored it. But what made this day truly special wasn't just the correction of past wrongs. It was the conscious choice to create a space that reflected who we are, not who someone else expected us to be. The contrast with Poppy's wedding was stark in my mind. Her event had been a spectacle, the culmination of lavish spending and parental obsession to make her feel like the golden child. Ice sculptures, a 10-piece band, 5-course meals, a custom couture gown. Every detail screamed display, status, and favoritism. The $75,000 her parents spent wasn't just money. It was a statement of value, an investment in her happiness at the expense of any balance or fairness. Our wedding, by contrast, felt grounded, intentional, and equitable. Every choice we made reinforced our values and our vision for a life together, built on partnership and respect rather than appearances. Even the moments of quiet reflection highlighted the growth I had experienced. Practical didn't feel small anymore. Choosing a modest, elegant gown, hosting a focused and meaningful guest list, selecting a familiar and comfortable venue. These weren't compromises. They were foundations. Practical meant stability, reliability, and intentionality. I could finally see that the practical aspects of life, careful planning, measured decision-making, thoughtful budgeting were not inferior to the flashy displays that my family valued. In fact, they were essential for building something that lasted throughout the day. I noticed how calm and peaceful I felt compared to the nervous anticipation and stress I had seen in Poppy's family during her wedding planning. There was no chaos, no frantic overbooking, no tension over expenses or appearances. The people who mattered were present, fully engaged, and emotionally available. And in those moments, I realized just how much the past had shaped me, not in a way that limited me, but in a way that made me deliberate, resilient, and fiercely committed to fairness. My past experiences, the favoritism, the dismissals, the subtle insults, I had transformed all of that into insight and strategy that allowed me to design my life deliberately, on my own terms. As the night progressed and the reception wound down, I found myself quietly observing the dynamics of our family from the sidelines. Even though they weren't present, I imagined the fallout, the conversations, the bewilderment of my parents as they processed that the balance had been corrected. Their lessons, long ignored or selectively applied, were now inescapable. And while there was a bittersweet undertone, I felt no anger, no desire for revenge. I had achieved clarity and agency. I had drawn firm boundaries and enforced them. That in itself was liberating. Kyle and I stepped outside for a few moments, holding hands and looking at the stars. "It feels light," I whispered. He nodded, smiling. "It should. You've built something real, something that reflects you, not what anyone else wanted it to be." The weight of years of being overlooked, minimized, and forced into the background began to lift. I was no longer the second best, the quiet observer, the practical daughter lost in someone else's spotlight. I was the architect of my own life, constructing a foundation strong enough to support everything beautiful I wanted to build with Kyle. The celebration wasn't about grandeur or spectacle. It was about freedom, authenticity, and support. Watching friends laugh, seeing family members who genuinely cared, engaged, and happy. I understood that our wedding wasn't just a day, it was a manifestation of years of effort to claim my space and assert my worth. Every decision, from guest list to dress to venue, reinforced the principle that respect, love, and equality were the real markers of a meaningful life. In the weeks and months afterward, the family fallout became more apparent. My parents and Poppy were furious, launching a quiet smear campaign among extended family. We heard that some relatives believed we were being cold, mercenary, or vindictive, but the people who mattered, the ones who understood the dynamics and had seen the favoritism firsthand, rallied around us. And I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, not from triumphing over them, but from building a life and celebrating a union that was genuinely ours. I watched Poppy's life shift as well. With the signed loan agreement in place, the constant off-the-books support from our parents stopped. She had to live within her means, and her flashy lifestyle changed significantly. Trips to Bali or Aspen were replaced by more grounded experiences. Designer purchases slowed. It wasn't about revenge, it was about the natural consequences of previous choices, made clear through transparency and accountability. Reflecting on it all, I realized how much I had grown. Practical was no longer a synonym for boring or second best. It meant a solid, reliable foundation, the kind that allowed beautiful things like our marriage, our home, our life together to be built securely. I had learned to set boundaries without apology, to enforce fairness with clarity, and to design outcomes that reflected my values rather than inherited expectations. I felt empowered, free, and at peace. Looking back at the ceremony, the intimate guests, the genuine smiles, and the ease of the day, I understood something profound. The flashy's extravagant displays are fleeting. The thoughtful, deliberate construction of life, built on mutual respect and equality, is enduring. Kyle and I had created not just a wedding, but a foundation for a future that was strong, spacious, and filled with light. And for the first time, I felt fully at home in my own life, fully recognized, fully valued, and completely free. Thea's story is a powerful reminder of the importance of fairness, standing up for yourself, and setting boundaries, even when it's hard. Sometimes the most meaningful victories aren't loud, they're quiet, deliberate, and deeply personal. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to navigate family dynamics or stand your ground in a situation like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments and share your experiences. It's amazing how much we can learn from each other's stories, right?